You open up a giant map and see a cluster of Pacific islands stamped with the words United States and an American flag. But how did that happen? Today, I'll explain how Hawaii went from being its own independent kingdom to becoming the 50th US state, and I'll explain it to you like you're 5 years old. And by the end, you'll understand one of the most dramatic takeovers in American history, complete with kings, queens, pineapples, and some very sneaky business deals. Once upon a time, long before your grandparents were even born, Hawaii wasn't part of America at all. It was its own country, just like how France is its own country or how Japan is its own country. Hawaii had its own kings and queens, its own laws, its own money, and its own way of doing things. The Hawaiian people had been living on these beautiful islands for over 1,000 years, long before any Europeans even knew that the islands existed. Imagine you have your own treehouse, and you get to make all the rules about who can come in and what games you play. That's kind of what Hawaii was like. The Hawaiian kingdom was the treehouse, and the Hawaiian royalty got to decide everything that happened there. They had their own language, their own traditions, and their own government. Everything was going pretty well for them. But then in the late 1700s, some visitors started showing up. And these weren't just any visitors. These were explorers from faraway places like Britain and America. The most famous one was Captain James Cook, who arrived in 1778. When these explorers found Hawaii, it was like finding a secret treasure chest full of gold. The islands were incredibly beautiful, the weather was perfect, and the location was right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which made it a perfect stopping point for ships traveling between America and Asia. Now at first, the Hawaiian kingdom was happy to trade with these visitors. The Hawaiians would give them food, fresh water, and supplies, and the visitors would give them new tools, weapons, and other interesting things from their home countries. It seemed like a pretty good deal for everyone. But here's where things start to get a little complicated. Like when you're sharing your toys and suddenly everyone wants to keep them forever. Some of these visitors decided that they didn't just want to visit Hawaii, they wanted to stay. And not just stay as visitors, but stay as people who can make money and have power. These people were called missionaries, traders, and businessmen. Now, the missionaries came to teach the Hawaiian people about Christianity. The traders came to make money buying and selling things, and the businessmen came to start big companies. But remember, Hawaii still had its own king and queens making all the decisions. But these new people who had moved to Hawaii started having their own ideas about how things would be run. They were like house guests who started rearranging your furniture and telling you what to eat for breakfast. At first, the Hawaiian royalty tried to work with them, but the visitors kept wanting more and more control. And one of the biggest changes came from something that you probably eat sometimes: sugar. The businessmen who had moved to Hawaii realized that the islands were perfect for growing sugar cane. Sugar was really valuable back then. I mean, kind of like how oil is valuable today. So they started huge sugar plantations, which are like giant farms where they grew nothing but sugar cane. These plantations made tons of money, but they needed lots of workers. And the problem was, many of the native Hawaiian people didn't want to work on these plantations. So the plantation owners brought in workers from other countries like China, Japan, Portugal, and the Philippines. Soon, there were more non-Hawaiian people living in Hawaii than actual Hawaiian people. It was like if strangers just moved into your neighborhood until there were more strangers than original neighbors. As more and more non-Hawaiian people moved to the islands, they started wanting more say in how the government worked. They formed groups and organizations, and they started pressuring the Hawaiian kings and queens to give them more power. It was like if all your house guests got together and demanded that they should get to decide what TV shows to watch and what to have for dinner. The Hawaiian kingdom tried to keep control, but it was getting harder and harder. The businessmen had lots of money, and money meant power. They could hire lawyers, they could buy newspapers, and they could influence politicians. Meanwhile, the native Hawaiian people were losing their land, their jobs, and their political power. But things got really serious in 1887, when something that historians call the Bayonet Constitution happened. Now, this wasn't actually about bayonets, which are those pointy things that go on the end of guns. It was called that because the Hawaiian king, King Kalukua, was basically forced to sign a new constitution at gunpoint. A group of businessmen, mostly white Americans who lived in Hawaii, demanded that the king give up most of his power and let them run the government instead. This new constitution was like if someone came to your house and said, "You can still live here, but we're going to decide what you eat, when you go to bed, and who your friends can be." The king had to agree because, well, he didn't have enough military power to fight back. It was a really unfair situation, but the businessmen had all the money and weapons. The Bayonet Constitution did several terrible things. It took away the right to vote for most native Hawaiian people and from Asian immigrants who had been brought to work on the plantations. Only people who owned property or had high incomes could vote. And, well, guess who that was? Mostly the white American businessmen. It was like changing the rules of a game right in the middle so that only your team could win. When King Kalakaua died in 1891, his sister became queen. Her name was Queen Liliuokalani, and she was the last queen that Hawaii would ever have. Queen Liliuokalani was smart and brave, and she saw what was happening to her country and her people. She decided she wasn't going to just sit there and let the businessmen take over everything. So in 1893, Queen Liliuokalani tried to create a new constitution that would give power back to the Hawaiian people and take it away from the foreign businessmen. She wanted to restore the voting rights that had been taken away and give the monarchy back its proper authority. It was like trying to take back control of your own treehouse from people who had been bossing you around. But the businessmen weren't going to let that happen. They had gotten used to being in charge, and they were making too much money to give up now. So they did something really sneaky and really wrong. They organized what they called a committee of safety. But it wasn't about keeping people safe at all. It was all about keeping their own power and money safe. And on January 17, 1893, this committee of safety, with help from U.S. Marines who were stationed in Hawaii, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani's government. They basically kicked her out of power and said that they were now in charge. It was like if a group of bullies came to your school, kicked out the principal, and declared themselves the new bosses. The queen did try to fight back, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. The Committee of Safety immediately declared that Hawaii was no longer a kingdom. Instead, they said it was now the Republic of Hawaii, with them in charge. But here's the thing. Most Hawaiian people never actually agreed to this. It wasn't like they voted and decided that they wanted a new government. A small group of businessmen just took it over by force and said, "This is how it's going to be now." Queen Liliuokalani was put under house arrest, which means that she had to stay in her palace and wasn't allowed to leave. She spent her time writing music and hoping that the United States government would help restore her to power. She thought that surely the American government would see what had happened and think it was wrong and help fix it. And you know what? Some people in the American government did think it was wrong. President Grover Cleveland investigated what had happened and concluded that the overthrow was illegal. He said that Queen Liliuokalani should be restored to power. But the businessmen who had taken over Hawaii refused to give up control. They basically said, "Too bad, we're not giving it back." So Hawaii was stuck in this weird situation. It wasn't really an independent country anymore because a small group of people had taken over, but it also wasn't part of the United States yet. The businessmen who were now running Kauai kept asking the US government to annex Hawaii, which means to officially make it part of America. But for several years, the US government said no. But everything changed in 1898 when America went to war with Spain. This was called the Spanish-American War, and suddenly the United States realized that having a military base in the middle of the Pacific Ocean would be really useful. And Hawaii was unfortunately the perfect location for ships and soldiers traveling to the Philippines, which America had just taken from Spain. So, even though most Hawaiian people still didn't want to become a part of America, the US Congress voted to annex Hawaii anyways. And on July 7, 1898, Hawaii officially became a US territory. It was like if you were playing in your backyard and suddenly your neighbor put up a fence and said, "This is my yard now, and you have to follow my rules." Being a territory meant that Hawaii was part of America, but not a full state. The people living there were American citizens, but they couldn't vote for president, and they didn't have voting representatives in Congress. They were like second-class Americans. The territorial government was mostly controlled by the same businessmen who had overthrown the Queen, and they made sure things stayed the way they wanted them to. For the next 60 years, Hawaii remained a territory, and during this time, the sugar plantations continued to make huge profits, and later, pineapple plantations became big businesses as well. The military became more and more important, especially after Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan in 1941, which brought America into World War II. After World War II, though, things finally started to change. Many of the soldiers who had been stationed in Hawaii during the war went home and told people how beautiful and wonderful the islands were. Tourism started to become a big business, and at the same time, the children and grandchildren of the plantation workers from Asia had grown up, gone to school, and become doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business owners. They wanted more political power and representation. There was also a growing movement for Hawaiian statehood. Many people felt that after 60 years as a territory, Hawaii deserved to become a full state with all the rights and representation that came with it. The military importance of Hawaii during World War II and the Cold War also made Congress more willing to consider statehood. And in 1959, Congress finally voted to admit Hawaii as the 50th state. On June 27, 1959, Hawaiians voted overwhelmingly in the favor of statehood. And on August 21, 1959, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the proclamation that officially made Hawaii a state. After more than 60 years as a territory, Hawaii finally had full representation in Congress and could vote for president. But here's something important to remember. Even though Hawaii became a state, many of the problems that started with the overthrow of the kingdom never really went away. Native Hawaiian people still struggled to maintain their culture, their language, and their connection to the ancestral lands. Many of the big businesses were actually still controlled by the same families that had taken over in the 1890s, and the tourism industry, while bringing money to the island, also brought challenges like high costs of living and environmental problems. Today, there are still ongoing discussions about the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. In 1993, exactly 100 years after Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown, the US Congress passed an official apology acknowledging that the overthrow was illegal and that the native Hawaiian people never gave up their claims to sovereignty. But an apology doesn't undo what happened or solve any of the problems that resulted from it. So, let's recap this whole wild story. Hawaii started as an independent kingdom with its own rulers and people. Foreign businessmen moved in and gradually took more and more control until they overthrew the queen and stole the country. The US eventually took over and made Hawaii a territory, then finally a state 60 years later. It's a story about power, money, and how sometimes bigger countries take over smaller ones, even when it's not right. But now you know why those beautiful islands in the Pacific have American flags flying over them. And it's way more complicated than just they wanted to join America. So here's the whole story in simple terms. Hawaii was like a kid with their own awesome treehouse kingdom. Then some grown-up bullies moved into the neighborhood, decided they wanted the treehouse for themselves, and kicked the kid out even though it wasn't theirs to take. The bullies then convinced the biggest kid on the block, America, to let them join his group, and eventually the treehouse became part of America's collection. The original kid never really got their treehouse back, but hey, at least now everyone admits that what the bullies did was totally wrong. And that, my curious friends, is how a tropical paradise went from having queens and kings to having senators and congresspeople, through a tale of greed, power, and some seriously questionable decision-making that would probably make even a middle school student say, "Hey, that's not fair!"